and they are both against me. And she says, well, so are you. She says, you're as allied with nature as anybody, as your animus or your anima. And then we went to the fifth conversation.
Say, Craig.
And that was, go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, when you were talking about the relationship between the primary and secondary functions.
Yes.
I don't quite understand that. So you said the J had to do with the extroverted function, right?
Yes. Yes. J, well, the J or the P, either one, have to do with the extroverted function. So if you're going to, let's say, anytime you're an introvert, your P or J are going to refer not to your primary function. They're going to refer to your secondary function, because, you know, in her case, she's an introverted feeling type with her secondary function being intuition. So her dominant function, feeling, is introverted. Her secondary function, intuition, is extroverted intuition. You know, so that means she would be, her extroverted okay, she'd be an INFP then. I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. P refers to the to sensation and introversion, sensation and intuition, because those are the ones that are just happen to you. Okay, so that's perceiving. That's the P, and then the her J functions would be feeling and thinking. So go ahead.
I understand this right, because the S and N functions just they happen to you. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they happen. They
and therefore an introvert is going to have a higher influence from that secondary function, and an extrovert would have a greater influence from the other two functions that are more participatory or something like that.
More outer world. So the outer world aspect of Anna is going to be her intuition. So I mean, that would kind of mean that instead of being an expert on the inner world, she's who can see what's coming, the whence and the whither of things. She's more seeing that in the outer world. Like she can probably predict some kind of something. She knows there's something in the air that's going to happen, you know, before anybody else does it. Where in the inner world, your intuition would be more that you seem to be able to formate the autonomous entities in the inner world better than other people, because you have introverted intuition, you know. So anyway, what do you think about that? Does that make any sense to you? Or
well, yes, you know, I'm teaching this class kind of on the principles, using the principles of alchemy and figure drawing. And one of the things that occurred to me is I'm an INFP, and most artists are introverts. And I think all the people in my class are introverts. So it occurs to me that an extroverted person would need a different kind of approach in order to be able to even understand this kind of view into the inner world.
Well, Jung, one thing Robert Johnson discovered is that Jung would always speak in your psychological type without even asking you what it was, because he sensed it, you know. So if you're an INFP, then what that means is just based on what Myers-Briggs system says, you know, is that your dominant function, which you use, your go-to function, is feeling, and that means relatedness and ranking things. it does not mean emotion. That's what they always say about a someone who's an expert in feeling, because they use, like an expert in sensation could repair anything, Well, an expert in feeling is, one of the Jung's analysts was Yolanda Jacobi, and she was from Hungary, and she was a feeling dominant. And, she was the one that founded the Jung Institute, because she was an extroverted feeling type. So she wanted to, there aren't very many extroverts in Jung, but she was one of them. And she was the one that founded it because, she just was related to people and wanted to bring them in. And so, that's what they say, a person who's got a very developed feeling function can tell you without any emotion, I hate you. I think you're a horrible person. And they just have a straight look on their face, and they don't care what you think. They're just telling you that. So there's not an emotive quality. The emotive quality would be in their inferior function, which would be, the door to the unconscious, because it's the most undeveloped. And in my case, it's sensation. So whenever I'm trying to fix something, my wife says I start using all kinds of F-bombs all the time, and I said, I did? Yeah, you should have heard yourself, but it's just because I can't hammer a nail in straight, can't screw without stripping the threads, I'm just horrible at it. But anyway, so she's an introverted feeling type. And so that might, amongst the fact that her instincts are wounded, she has this problem that her feeling is not directed towards the outer world; it's directed towards the inner world.
Let me see if I'm referring to this right.
Mm-hmm.
In an introvert, the inferior function would be either the S or the N. Is that what you're saying?
Well, okay. And an introvert can have a dominant function in any of those. You could be an introverted sensate, an introverted intuitive, an introverted thinking type, or an introverted feeling type. Okay. But then your secondary function is going to be your extroverted function. So the introverted functions of those four are all going to be somehow mysteriously turned towards the inner world. Now, then
I'm confusing what the numbers refer to. So the primary would be the first letter, I or E.
Okay, well, you don't know. The P or J will tell you what the primary is. Okay, because it's the in an extrovert, the P or J will always refer to the secondary function. Okay, but in an introvert, the P or J are going to refer to the extroverted function, but it's going to be not the primary, it's going to be the secondary. It's because they're an introvert. So if you're an INFP, the P refers to those two functions that just happen to you, which are intuition or sensation. They just happen. Thinking and feeling require a little bit of your conscious awareness, so they're more under the control of the ego, where intuition and sensation have absolutely the ego, they just happen to the ego. So the ego is a victim of those two, and so if you're an go ahead.
Well, I'm just still not following the whole thread. So I'm an INFP.
Mm-hmm.
So what's my primary and secondary function?
Okay, your primary function for an introvert is going to be told by what the P or J are. So since you're an INFP, that means your primary function is not a J. The J would be thinking or feeling. So your primary function, if you're an INFP, is going to be your introverted function, and the P or J tell you what the extroverted function would be in an introvert. Okay. So let's not even talk about extroverts. The P or the J are going to refer to your secondary function every time. So so an INFP, if they're a P, that means their secondary extroverted function is going to be either sensation or intuition. Okay. And since you're identifying as an INFP, that means you are a feeling type, an introverted feeling type with very strong intuitive capabilities. But those are extroverted. And so that's typical of an artist. You know, I mean, your intuitive creative ability is going into outer creative work. So, you know, if you're not a sensate, it's good to be an extroverted intuitive. You know, I mean, that if you're an artist or a craftsman of any type that's using their hands. So if you're an introverted intuitive, that's not going to really help you. And if you're an introverted sensate, I don't know how much that would help you, but usually that refers to more ritual activities. It's actually very simple, you know. I think if you just can go through the examples. If you're an introvert, P or J always refer to the non-dominant function, the secondary function, which is extroverted. If you're an extrovert, the P or J always are going to refer to the extrovert function, but because you're an extrovert, it's going to be your dominant function. And so then if I say, let's say I'm an ENFP, okay? So if I'm an ENFP, then my dominant function is going to be, okay, so my secondary function is going to be one of the, I would also be, I would be a dominant intuitive, because the P refers to the extroverted function. Okay, I'm an ENFP. The P refers to the extroverted function. My extroverted function, P refers to sensate or intuition, and that's my extroverted function. So that's going to be intuition. So if I'm an ENFP, I'm an extroverted intuitive type with feeling as my secondary. If I'm an INFP, I'm an introverted feeling type with intuition as my secondary. So what do you think, Tim? Is it too confusing?
Yes, it's very confusing. I've written it down exactly the opposite 2 times.
Okay, well, let's just put it this way. Every time the fourth letter, the P or the J, refer to whatever function you have that's extroverted, okay? It's always refers to the one you use in the outer world. Okay, so if you're an introvert, it's going to your extroverted function is going to be your secondary function, not your primary. And if you're an extrovert, your secondary function is going to be introverted, not extroverted, because the function that you use in the outer world, extroverted, primary function is going to be, you know, the one is going to be your dominant function. So it's if you can really just get that the P or the J are always going to refer to the extroverted function, regardless of whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you got it. Okay, but you got to kind of work through it. Like, you see, I was getting confused when I was talking about an ENFP, and I said, wait a second, Craig, the P or J doesn't refer to the to the secondary function. Now it refers to the extroverted function, and I am an extrovert, so I'm an extroverted intuitive with secondary feeling. Okay, if I'm an INFP, what's my extroverted function? It's not a P, so it's not intuition or sensation, so it must be an F. You know, so if I'm an INFP, I'm an introverted feeling type with intuition as my secondary extroverted function.
It makes me wonder why ordering of the letters doesn't change with the hierarchy then.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's say you're an INFJ, okay? All right. What if you're an INFJ, what's your extroverted function? It's going to be the either thinking or feeling. And if you're an INFJ, you're an introvert, and the J refers to the extroverted function. So, and that's either thinking or feeling. That means that your secondary is feeling, not intuition. You're a dominant. I am an INF. I am TJ. INTJ. So my J refers to the extroverted function. I'm an accountant. You know, so my extroverted function is thinking. So if I was an ENTJ, and I'm so J is referring to my extroverted function, then I'm a extroverted thinking type with intuition as my secondary function.
So it just makes me wonder why, if the order is delineated by those principles, it seems like it would be more reasonable to change the order of the four functions according to which is most dominant in the personality.
Well, I think you could do that, but Myers and Briggs just chose to do it this way.
Oh, I see.
And when Jung was doing it, he only had 8 personality types because he wasn't concerned with the secondary function. In fact, he wasn't even concerned with the primary function. What he wanted to know is what your inferior function was, because that was the door to the unconscious. So Jung, if Jung knew that you were an introverted, intuitive, like I am, he'd say, let's talk about sensation, because that's your road to God. And this is actually what the great mother has been telling me over and over again, is you need to get your feet on the ground. You need to smell the earth. You need to, your spirit, you're a person who needs to be around woodpeckers and who are, the spirit of rooted things, or around beavers, who are also involved with trees and things, and the depths. So the beaver is the opposite, where the woodpecker is the aerial being of the rooted things. The beaver is the depth being of the rooted things. And anyway, she's telling me that's your instincts, Craig, and you need to be in touch with those. And that's what Jung, if you read his book, Psychological Types, he does describe the dominant functions, but he doesn't go into the secondary functions at all. Myers and Briggs did that, and some people say that that was a distortion of psychological types. It's not at all. It was Briggs worked with Jung since the 20s. She was a student of his, and it just fascinated her. So she knew exactly what she was doing. Other than she came up with a nomenclature, Tim, that you don't like. I think you could come up with a different one, reordering it, as you say. That could have very well been done. But somehow she chose this strange thing that the 4th letter refers to the extroverted function, regardless of whether you're an introvert or extrovert. So if you're an introvert, it's referring to your secondary function. If you're an extrovert, it's referring to your primary function. And that was the way she chose to, from the 4 letters, tell what was your dominant, what was your secondary. She used the 4th letter, and the P refers to the ones that just happen to the ego, and the J refers to the ones that the ego has some control over. And so that the feeling function is not emotion too. So you have a lot of control over feeling if you're a feeling type.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is highly dynamic compared to anything I've ever learned about the personality types. This whole idea that there's far more to the equation than simply identifying yourself in these four areas. So even the feelings, I mean, I've heard that misused a lot by people. This
Always.
idea of feeling
Jung
function.
hated the English word feeling.
So I'm wondering if I could break this down a little bit, and Tim might be getting a pretty good grasp on this now, but I'm still working through it. But if we just start from the first, it sounds like everything happens from that first function, extroversion or introversion. It sounds like that's the
Yeah.
key to what everything else
Those
falls
are
into.
called attitudes. You know,
Attitudes. Okay.
introverted or extroverted is an attitude, and then the other four are the functions. So if it goes, I'm just giving you a little bit of differentiation. You said it all starts with whether you're an introverted or extroverted attitude, just so you don't confuse it with the functions. The functions, there's four of them. You know, so I didn't mean to
So the,
step on you,
the
but
functions are the middle four.
yes.
Okay.
So the introverted and extroverted refer to the attitude you take towards the okay, it's where it's an energy flow. Okay, if you're an extrovert, have an extroverted attitude, your energy comes when you're out with other people or in the outer world. If you're an introvert and you're out doing in the outer world, your energy's drained. So the introvert gains energy when they're alone. You know, I mean, they need solitude, you know, and the extrovert does not want solitude. They want to always be out with people, doing things in the outer world. And if you told them to, why don't you go sit in a room and meditate for a while, they'd look at you like you were, why would I waste my time doing that? So, you know, where an introvert, he says, you want to go to a party? There's going to be all kinds of people there. And you say, hell no, I want to sit home and, you know, just be quiet, you know. So that's that's what I meant, Steve, is just that just so you're, that helps. Don't you think that clarifies a little bit? If introversion and extroversion are not functions, they're attitudes, you know, and then you're talking about the functions.
So what is the P and the J then?
Okay, well, first of all, let's just talk about the functions. It's a quaternity, and you've got one binary of the quaternity is intuition and sensation. Okay, and sensation is perceiving with the five senses. Okay, and intuition is perception of the fourth dimension. You know, it's the one function that does not work in time and space. So the intuitive function is a perceiving of the synchronistic events. Okay, so they're both perceiving functions. One perceives with the five senses in the outer world, the sensation. The intuitive perceives events of the synchronistic world. That is where spirit and the material are one. Okay, and that could either be predicting a war is about to start, or predicting that Picasso and Einstein are coming, you know, or, you know, every poet, every artist is a seer of events in the inner world, you know, if they're really in tune with it. I mean, they are the canary in the coal mine, you know. I mean, they can tell that there's this foreign substance moving in to what we were used to before, you know. I mean, one you know, I would say Wordsworth and William Butler Yeats were prophets of what happened in the with art, music, poetry, and even science and religion. Because, you know, they said turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, mere anarchy, has come upon the world. I mean, this is actually describing what happened to the dominant religions, you know, in the world of rational materialism. You know,
This is post World War I.
Post World War One. And you know what was really interesting is right after post World War One, you had all these extremely great men and women, you know, and yet when you get into the 30s and 40s, you don't have it anymore. I mean, who are the great men of the second half of the 20th century? They're mostly politicians, you know. I mean, there weren't a lot of figures in the arts. You could probably name some, Tim. I mean, I think jazz and folk music were, you know, Bob Dylan and I think Duke Ellington and Count Basie and, you know, some of those people were, but they were also, you know, a little bit later. But anyway, I mean, that right now, who are the great figures in art and music? And do they speak to the popular world, or do they speak to the zeitgeist of the evolving God image? You know, I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't know, who's that guy that writes all the scary books? I can't remember his name.
Stephen King.
Yeah, Stephen King, or the one that writes about all those movies they did about, you know, the Dobador or whatever it is. You know, I mean, I don't know if those. Yes. Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, what do you think about that now? Does that any?
Well, it's interesting.
The functions.
It's interesting to think about that, because I've been kind of embarrassed as a contemporary artist that I find very little inspiration in contemporary art.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that way for 40 years. I think the abstract expressionists were fascinating, and stuff going on in music is fascinating, like fusion jazz and hip hop and that kind of thing. But in the visual arts, I have a hard time attaching to anything with any really great meaning. And every so often there's somebody that really blows me over. Like, I'm thinking of this Russian artist Ibakov, who worked in the 70s and 80s, who does these really weird kind of experimental installations. And I'm captivated by something he does that I think is not the cause of his popularity. There's another guy, a Canadian sculptor named Mark Pent, who became kind of quickly famous in Canada, and then quit and moved into a different kind of work. And so it's not like my sensitivities have turned off, but I'm not finding anything that is really compelling. And I go back particularly to the 1880s, and almost everybody who's working is really compelling to me. And so I'm trying to figure out what in the world is going on here. I know that there's a parallel between what's happening in society in the 1880s and what's happening now, this kind of blossoming of a spiritual value that comes up in Impressionism and symbolism, in art and literature. But other than that, I'm not sure why I can't find inspiration in contemporary art. It's just is really confusing to me.
Well, you know, there's the Tao of the moment, you know, and if you look at any decade, there is a feeling to that decade. I mean, if you look at the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. I mean, I'm a little lost now. I don't even know what to call them, the 10s or the 20s. I guess we can call them the 20s now.
Yeah.
But, I mean, what's the dominant attitude right now? Now, I think one of the things, and our son-in-law is a philosopher, I don't know, I mean, professor, and I ran this by him one time, and the fact that from like the 60s and 70s onward, you didn't see these great figures in art. He says, well, maybe there's something collective happening, and it isn't to do, it's a brooding or an incubating of what's went on before that needs to occur before the next explosion of people who are really tuned into the song of the universe and can express and are able to express it in some manner, either through poetry, art, music, or whatever. And I think right now we are going through what T.S. Eliot called the wasteland. I think to some extent this is due to the enantiodromia of the conscious extroverted attitude being overvalued. Now that's going to reach a pinnacle at some point, and then it's going to start going the other way. But when that's going to happen, I would guess, it looks to me like sometimes those are like maybe 3 to 4 generations. So it might be 70, 80 years before something happens. I don't know. What do I know? But anyway, that is just something. I think right now it's because of the dominant. But there's undercurrents. Like Franz Kafka. None of his works were published during his lifetime. In fact, he ordered that they all be burnt at his death. But his executor didn't do it, and they published them. And but this was after he died. So Joseph Campbell calls him a pratika Buddha. He's one who's a Buddha just for himself, and no one knows about this Buddha. So anyway, I just was bringing up the fact that she identifies as an introverted feeling type with intuition as her secondary function, and I said, oh yeah, that explains a little bit. So I don't know if it does for you guys, but I think to me it was somewhat explanatory. Well, if you want to, we can just, do you guys have anything else you'd want to talk about? I'm so sorry I had that darn sound off.
This is fascinating to me because I'm thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking about things like Andy Warhol, who is,
yes,
maybe the most famous artist of his generation. And I certainly see what that is all about. And I get the frustration with commercialism and how prominent that has become for Western civilization or contemporary world. But I find very little in it that I can chew on.
Yeah, it seems very extroverted to me. I mean, it's all to do, even though he was a very good craftsman and he was doing a pretty good job of expressing the Tao of this moment, And
then I look at like the minimalists who were really prominent when I was in art school. I went to art school in London, and this was in 1980. And at the time, I'm a figurative artist working in a world where almost all the artists were simply, drawing geometrical figures in really flat, sort of meaningless, but very simplified forms. And I never did get that. And I get it sort of spiritually because it expresses these simple ideas like Buddhism and, becoming one with everything. But there's nothing sensual about it. And I can look at minimalism all day and I can understand it with my brain, but there's nothing in my body that can get a nutrient out of that.
It's a little, this is kind of the architectural spirit of Scandinavia, is where you'll go out into a completely white field. There's no tables or chairs, and just have a little white vase, everything's white on white. But
Yeah.
you know, minimalism in Japanese paintings or Chinese painting, you know, you'll see about 3/4 of the canvas are empty space, and you know, the painting will be called The Fisherman, you know, and there's some weeds, and then far off is a mountain with maybe a waterfall, and way over in the back, you can't hardly see it, is the figure of a fisherman, you know. So that is very very Zen, you know, or haiku. I mean, you know, it's
Right, and that's a
you think. I mean, it's focusing in the art on nature,
yeah.
but in the way it names it, it's saying, consider the fisherman here in this great scene. What is his? He's not very important here, you know. I mean.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there is an aspect of the minimalist in the Japanese and Chinese paintings that is does speak, you know, but when you get so abstract, you know, I don't know whether that's way above or you've just spun off into nihilism. I don't know, you know. I mean, are you expressing a nihilistic attitude when you're doing minimalism, or are you trying to express some other idea? You know, I don't know. I mean, where you know, so important. What's so important in music are the spaces between notes and how
Yeah.
long they are. You know,
Well, it's interesting that during the 80s, I got introduced to this artist in Denver who is a maximalist. And he became a really good friend of mine. And I spent some time in his studio kind of doing an artist in residency. And he is, for one thing, he's gay. And so he's got this really kind of flamboyant vision. And he got a lot of big contracts. Like he was contracted to help Hong Kong transition from British to independent rule in '97. So it was like a $5 million contract, and he was designing parades and fashion shows and stuff. And so I went to his studio. It's this massive place with half a dozen or a couple of dozen artists working in it. And there are beads and ribbons and paints of every type. And you know, it's an assault on the senses. And I kind of had a conversion because I never liked a lot of sparkly stuff. My eye just didn't like that. But I was very much converted. And we had a lot of conversations. He kept talking to me like I'm a philosopher of art, and he's a decorator. And I have to agree with that. I didn't find much substance in what he was doing, but my body was having a great time seeing all these different colors and textures and stuff like that. And
he's an extroverted. He's
yeah.
a master of ambience. You know, he's not speaking to the inner world. Yeah, there's something about.
I think this is where art intersects with the functions.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. I've never heard anybody talk about that. And it's really fascinating to me that it would be interesting to see a serious art critic look at this issue and say, how do the personality types impact art and how that relates to human society?
Group the art by the psychological types and see if you can take it. I mean, here's one that the INFPs did. Here's one that the ENFPs did, you know, and you start to compare and contrast, see if you see anything. You know, if you're an introverted feeling type with extroverted intuition, your vision, you know, like those four, what I call the medicine wheel that Jung does, is going to be different in each one of those four quaternities, you know. And so what is the expression of that quaternity, you know, of INFP? You know, that's going to be different and you're speaking a different language, Jung said, and Robert Johnson said, than an ENFP would, you know, where they're going to speak a little bit different language than you. But it's really is fascinating. And you know, by the way, if you ever near the Bitterroot Mountains, I think it's near Stevensville, Montana. I might have that name wrong. Yeah. My wife's good friend, Bobby McKibben, lives there, and she's well, she's transgender, but and she was a man, and she married, and she's still married to his wife, but she does a lot of what's called plein air, you know, and she does it at Yellowstone and everything. So you might want to look her up sometime. And I mean, we were in her studio, and I was just thinking about her when you were describing all these beads and things. Her studio is just absolutely huge, and it's full of all these different pastels, and you know, it's right on the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains, and it's
Wow.
quite a scene.
Yeah, I'll try to look her up.
Well, yeah, Bobby, Bobbi McKibben, and she's actually from Grinnell College, and she was great friends of my wife's father, who was a professor there, you know. Well, anyway, do you guys want to maybe we could just discuss this one. Let's see. This is the 6th conversation with the Great Mother. Remember, we just got done talking about fate with the small f, which is given to you by the self. Let's say the self instead of God, or given to you, it's the divine germ within you. And she says in before here that the divine seed or divine germ is the what the Father gives you that needs to become the divine child, or needs to become the conscious. When you have made God conscious in your life, then that is the divine child or the moon child. And you're given that seed. It's the rhizome, or it's your small f fate that's supposed to turn into big F fate, you know. So that is your symbolic task in your life, and it's really your ontological purpose. So anyway, either Gary or somebody want to read the or Steve? I can read it here real quick, and we can move on. It's just the 6th conversation with the Great Mother. She says, because I want to develop the spiritual woman in myself, and because you told me that nothing can fall totally out of the psyche, I tried to find a spiritual equivalent for presumably lost parts of my soul. Do I understand a receptive feminine attitude towards God or towards fate to be a spiritual equivalent for feminine receptiveness expressed in the act of love? And might spiritual motherhood find expression in my hope of fulfilling my fate in order to place it in God's hands as a thing born out of me? And after having cherished it in my soul, I had an inspiration about how I might see spiritual life in general. I saw what in this world we call real life as a symbol for real life with R and L, and the latter being, and I'd just say, the self's or God's life in us, or that part of the self that lives our life in us, that part of the wisdom of the depths that lies in us. When I look at this way, it seems very unimportant whether I am enjoying or suffering my so-called earthly life, this being in higher reality what I can experience in God's life. Now, that's just her talking, and the Great Mother didn't even answer, so it's a little bit worked over on the conscious attitude. But you know, I just kind of went through that a little bit myself. I mean, the thing she's trying to do is she's trying to link the spiritual equivalent of being the receptive feminine attitude towards the self or towards the rhizome. In other words, she's going to be the feminine vehicle of the self in the outer world, which is she calls being a nun. but I think that has negative connotations to it. You know, she is to be a someone. She's supposed to be like these women at Eleusis, and these women. She's supposed to be a woman who has a somewhat of a shamanic type task, and that is to be the bride of the self in the outer world, like Tony Wolff was. You know, I mean, she was very much that her whole life. You know, and so she says now she still can't get away from this fact that her meaning in life is the sexual function. So she says, now is this the spiritual equivalent of being a feminine receptive in the act of love, you know, an act of a man having coitus with her? So she's saying the spiritual equivalent of this sexuality, which she lacks in her life, and she feels then inferior to other women, and feels guilty towards men because of this. Are they the same? And then she talks about, well, let's go to the next step. Let's talk about spiritual motherhood, you know, and is being a mother in the inner world is the spiritual equivalent of that, fulfilling the rhizome, you know, fulfilling the capital F fate in the outer world with her rhizome. And so that's her being her mother. And that was what Jung actually said in the Red Book. He says, I love you as the mother loves the unborn whom she carries in her heart. So, I mean, here he's talking about giving giving birth to the divine seed that you're unconscious of. Okay, so you're giving the divine seed when you were born, and it needs to be germinated, and it needs to develop and flower in the outer world consciously. If you don't do it consciously, it really it doesn't happen. The divine child's not born. The only way it can be born is if ego and the rhizome allow this divine thing to have expression in the outer world. And so anyway, that's the divine child that she is born. And then she says it's unimportant if that's true, if real life with an R and an L is to be the vehicle of the self's experience of in the outer world, and she's the vehicle of that, then it's unimportant that I suffer in this earthly life, because the earthly life is my experience of the self's life in me. So now think about that there. That's a really good expression for individuation. She says that for me, earthly life is not having a sexual partner or being a physical mother to a bunch of children and raising them up with this maternal earthly existence with a man who is I have this sexual relationship with. She says earthly life for me is my experience of the self's life in me. So that means that you're having a dialogue with the inner autonomous figures within yourself and experiencing the divine drama that is happening in the inner world through your existence and with your soul. Remember, when you were born with a inner contrasexual half, which is your soul. So it'd be, for us, it would be our anima. We share our existence with that anima. She is the guide. She can be either a negative guide or a positive guide. She can either lead you, as Neumann says, to I think what I liked what Miles was talking about last time about AA, you know, that if you don't if you don't if the anima does not separate from your shadow, then they are both aligned against you. That's what Anna says is happening to her. That she tells the Great Mother that the animus, who's a negative animus, so he's demonic, he's not the greater spirit. You know, a positive animus would be the great spirit within a woman that leads her to an ascent, you know, because she's earth in need of spirit. That would be the positive animus. The negative animus would be the demonic aspect. And this would be a figure that, and we experience this figure, both men and women, the inner critic. No matter what you do, it tells you you're screwing up here. You know, let's say you're following the rhizome, you're following the inner voice, and it tells you this is bullshit, you know, why don't you go do something else? I mean, that is the voice of what is called, you know, the, I did find this, and it was really, I thought it was kind of cool, was this thing here about the, what's called the antimimon pneuma, the ungodly, the ungodly intellect or the counterfeit spirit. You know, aerial spiritual image implies complete perversion and misuse of the spirit, a kind of black devilish spirit. It's the epitome of the negative intellect and of disruptive doubt, you know. So it's the seeds of doubt, you know. So her animus in her is the seeds of doubt. And the only way that she can make her animus positive is to separate the shadow from him. And so they won't be aligned against it. She separates the shadow and then she integrates it and assimilates it. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that her shadow is a positive shadow. Her animus is a negative animus, but her shadow is a positive shadow. And so her shadow is the instinctual life. You know, it's the life of a normal female who is very sensual. She's, you know, she's a introverted feeling type with intuition as her secondary function. So she's very far away from sensation. And by the way, her inferior function is thinking. And that's animus, you know. So, I mean, and then her father was a horrible person, you know. So, I mean, she's really struggling with something. And, you know, Gary was mentioning last time how this active imagination is going. And we can kind of finish up here with anything you guys want to say. But what is really interesting about the whole active imagination to me is most therapists who deal with what's called the conscious attitude, you know, never get anywhere because they're, you know, rearranging the decks or the chairs on the Titanic, you know, or what Jung said, you're chasing your own tail. You're like a dog chasing your own tail. But in her case, because of her treating this as the divine drama in her life is her not being able to being her instinctual life being so repressed. And you saw that in the Great Vision. And the fact that she's going to be, you know, the Virgin Mary, you know, I mean, so and feel no lust or senses when she has sex. I mean, it's just a real cutoff from the instinctual world. So that her shadow is very positive, and yet it's nature, and the animus is this devilish being, and they are both controlling her. We'll see later that the shadow and the animus split apart. The animus becomes positive. The shadow is now, she's more friendly to the instinctual existence. I had this problem. I'm my inferior function is sensation. So I spent my whole life saying things like, I don't feel comfortable in my own skin. Now I do feel comfortable in my own skin now, but I was separated from the instincts as well. But anyway, so do you guys have any concluding thoughts?
I was just going to say, one of the things that I found really interesting about this is I think she was like a perfect example of someone that, like Jung would say, well, they really, it's like an impossible problem. And the only way they can get better is to become somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I think that's what she's doing. I mean, she's completely releasing this vision that she originally had. And it's also a shamanic path because, her cure is really, I mean, she's doing it to herself. And that's kind of the test of a shaman is that, they have to be crazy. And she was neurotic. And then they have to heal themselves. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just so impressed with what she did. And that,
and they call this, this fact that you have this neurosis or like claustrophobia or her thing, it's the road to Damascus. This is the road to meaning. So this is her road to meaning. Is she needs to and when she becomes another person, what she really does is what the Great Mother keeps telling her over and over again, is that you are holding on to the ego so tightly, you need to let it go. We're going to find that in the next one, which is one of the most beautiful ones, or I think it's the 9th one, where she thinks she's about to die. And we'll talk about that next time, but she really thinks she's going to die.
Wouldn't it make sense, though, that she's hanging on to the ego so tightly? Because, I mean, she is invested like her whole life in this.
That's what she says, too. She says she's invested her whole life in this. And if she was to give it up, she would feel very weak. And the Great Mother says, well, you're pretty weak already. This isn't working. So what are you really giving up? You're not giving up that much, even though you've invested your whole life in this. That is what has been this thing that happened to her from when she had this relationship with the Freudian analyst who rejects her, and then she spends the next 18 years just playing the piano. Then she goes to see Tony Wolff. Then she leaves Tony Wolff and draws these incredible paintings, which we'll see later. Then she spends another 18 years in the wilderness. And then she meets Emma Jung, who's the Great Mother. And finally, she finds this cure for thing. And it's really funny. The reason she goes back to Emma Jung is she's walking along a beach, and somebody throws a ball, and it hits her right in the head, and she has to go to the hospital, and this thing that hit her in the head is wholeness. It's the roundness. So, the self couldn't get through to her any other way. So synchronistically, it had wholeness, hit her in the head, and sent her to the hospital. And this is really what brought her to Emma Jung. Don't you think that's beautiful? It's just wonderful. Well, anyway, we'll regroup next time, and I'm telling you that 9th conversation is going to be is something you don't want to miss. So anyway, well, thank you guys very much. And next time, I think too, we can kind of link what we were talked about with Ion in with this too. So anyway, well, I'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thanks,
so
y'all.
much.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Okay.
guys.
Bye now. See you all.